But in the middle of a snowstorm on a road without guardrails, he stopped. The car opened the door and said, "Get out. Do you think you're so important that I have to take you along? You don't belong in my life anymore?" Without a glance back, he drove away as if I didn't exist. I didn't beg. I didn't resist. 2 days later, my phone had 47 missed calls, and that was the moment he realized everything was gone. If you've made it past the first minute, thank you. That means more than you know. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Your city, your country? I want to know. This story includes fictional elements built for entertainment and educational value. Names and settings are coincidental, but what it has to say to you is meaning. The first snowflakes of the season hit the windshield of Declan's Range Rover somewhere around Vail, Colorado, tiny, weightless things that touched the glass and disappeared before they could leave a mark. I watched them from the passenger seat, my hands resting in my lap, and thought about how deceptive snow could be. It always looked so peaceful from inside a warm car. Inside this car, though peaceful, wasn't quite the right word. The Range Rover was the kind of vehicle that cost more than the first house Maggie and I ever owned. The seats were heated Italian leather. The dashboard looked like something out of a science fiction film. Screens and sensors and ambient lighting that adjusted itself without being asked. The whole cabin was sealed so perfectly against the outside world that you couldn't hear the wind, couldn't feel the road, couldn't tell if you were doing 30 miles an hour or 90. It was engineered silence. Comfortable, expensive, and completely hollow. My son Declan sat behind the wheel in a charcoal cashmere sweater, one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the center console where his phone buzzed every few minutes. He hadn't said more than a dozen words since we left Denver. He didn't turn on the radio. In the back seat, his wife Vivian, a slender woman of 34, who had the resting posture of someone perpetually waiting to be photographed, had fallen asleep somewhere around Golden. Her head tilted against the window, her sunglasses still on, despite the overcast sky. I had been watching Declan the way I used to watch unfamiliar lock mechanisms back in my working years. Quietly, patiently, looking for the thing that didn't quite fit. I spent 50 years in the security business, locks, vaults, access systems. I started in a basement shop in Brooklyn with $200 and a set of borrowed tools. Over the decades, the work evolved. In the late 1980s, I co-developed one of the first biometric authentication systems for commercial bank vaults, a fingerprint and signature verification protocol that the industry eventually adopted as a standard. The licensing royalties from that patent came in for nearly 30 years. Maggie, who had a sharper eye for real estate than anyone I ever knew, had been quietly buying up small commercial properties across Colorado and Wyoming since the 1970s, warehouses, storefronts, parcels of land that nobody wanted until suddenly everybody did. And then there were the watches. 50 years of working for clients who sometimes paid in kind, a Patek Philippe here, a vintage Rolex there, pieces they swore were worth more than cash. They were right. I never sold a single one. $85 million sounds like an extraordinary number. And I suppose it is. But it didn't feel that way when you'd built it slowly, over half a century, one careful decision at a time. It felt like a life's work. Because that's exactly what it was. Declan had proposed this trip 3 weeks ago. We were on the phone, a rare enough occurrence these days, and he'd said in that smooth, rehearsed tone he used when he wanted something, "Dad, we haven't done anything together since Mom passed. Just the three of us. One weekend up in the mountains. For her." I'd held the phone for a moment and listened to the particular quality of that silence. Declan invoking Maggie's memory. Declan, who had skipped her funeral reception early because he had a call with investors in Singapore. I said yes. Not because I believed him. I said yes. Because after 40 years of reading people through the locks they put on their doors, I'd learned that the best way to understand what someone really wanted was to let them show you. And I wanted to see exactly what my son was going to show me. The Range Rover hummed past a green highway sign, Vale 12 miles. The snow was picking up now, not falling so much as drifting sideways across the interstate in long, lazy sheets. I watched the mountains materializing through the haze and thought about the last time Maggie and I had driven this exact stretch of I-70. Winter of 2019. She'd made me pull over twice, once for a herd of elk standing in a field like they owned the whole state, and once for no reason she could explain, except that the light on the peaks was doing something she didn't have words for. We'd stood outside in the cold for 10 minutes just looking. She'd held my hand and not said anything, and that had been enough. There was no stopping today. I noticed the tablet first because of how casually it had been left on the center console, a deliberate carelessness, the kind that's designed to look accidental. It was angled just slightly toward me, the screen dimmed but still active. I could make out the title of the open document without leaning forward. Holt Estate Transfer Final Version. I didn't react. I didn't reach for it. I simply shifted my gaze back to the window and watched the snow collect along the guardrails, while something cold and clarifying settled in my chest. Something that had nothing to do with the weather outside. In my jacket pocket, my fingers found the old lock cylinder I'd carried for 30 years. A small brass thing worn smooth from handling the first mechanism I ever rebuilt entirely by hand, back when I was 22 years old and didn't know yet that I was any good at this. I carried it the way other men carried rosaries or worry stones, without thinking. When my mind needed to work, my fingers moved. They were moving now. Declan's phone buzzed again. This time he glanced at the screen, then said without looking at me, "I need to take this. Gas station coming up." He pulled off the interstate with the smooth efficiency of someone who had planned exactly this stop. The Range Rover rolled to a stop beside a pump. He stepped out, closed the door behind him with a soft, expensive click, and walked around to the far side of the building with the phone already at his ear. I sat alone in the sealed quiet of the car. The tablet screen had brightened slightly, a preview of the document visible in the corner. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. In my experience, the name on the door tells you more than anything you'll find inside. A man who labels a file final version has already decided the conversation is over before it begins. Through the windshield, I could see Declan pacing along the side of the building, one hand gesturing in the air the way he always did when he thought the person on the other end of the line was being slow. Behind me, Vivian stirred slightly in her sleep and then went still again. I turned the brass cylinder over once more in my fingers. Every lock I use to tell my apprentices will tell you exactly what it is if you're patient enough to listen. I was listening. He came back smiling. That was the first thing I noticed when Declan pulled open the driver's door and dropped back into his seat, the smile, wide and easy, the kind that belonged on a man who'd just closed a deal, not on a son returning from a gas station phone call during a family trip. He set his phone face down in the cup holder, ran a hand through his hair, and exhaled like a man releasing pressure he'd been holding for a while. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Great," he said. Just work stuff. Nothing serious." In the back seat, Vivian stirred. She lifted her sunglasses, blinked once, and sat up straight, with the alert composure of someone who hadn't actually been sleeping at all. She caught Declan's eyes in the rearview mirror for just a fraction of a second, the kind of look that passes between two people who have already rehearsed what comes next. I turned back to the window. The mountains had announced themselves properly now. The Rockies rose on either side of the interstate in broad, indifferent walls of stone and pine, their upper ridges swallowed by low cloud. The snow was coming down in earnest, no longer the tentative flurries from an hour ago, but a steady, purposeful fall that was starting to stick along the shoulders of the road. We were climbing. The engine note had shifted, and I could feel the grade in my chest. Maggie used to say that Colorado had a way of making you feel small that didn't feel like an insult. I understood what she meant. You looked up at those peaks, and you didn't feel diminished. You felt clarified. Reminded of what was actually large and what only seemed that way. I was thinking about that when Declan cleared his throat. "So, Dad," he said, with the careful lightness of a man who had practiced this opening line. "Vivian and I have been doing a lot of thinking about you, about making sure everything is set up right going forward." Vivian leaned forward slightly from the back seat, her forearms resting on the console between the two front seats. "We've been working with a financial advisor," she said. Her voice was warm and measured in equal parts. The voice of someone accustomed to being persuasive in rooms where persuasion required a soft touch. "Looking at ways to protect what you've built, to make sure it's structured properly for the future." I let them talk. This was something I learned early in my career. When you're dealing with a mechanism you don't fully understand, you don't force it. You apply light tension and you let the pins set themselves. You listen to what the lock is trying to tell you before you decide what to do about it. Declan was talking about asset protection strategies and tax efficiency, and something he called proactive estate planning. Vivian was adding numbers, percentages, projections, compound growth figures that floated through the air of the Range Rover, like they were designed to reassure rather than inform. It was a well-rehearsed performance. I could tell they'd run it before. I noticed Maggie's voice surface in my memory the way it sometimes did when I needed it most. We'd been watching Declan at his high school debate tournament. He was 16, already sharp. Already a little too comfortable with the way words could be arranged to mean something other than what they said. Afterward, driving home, Maggie had smiled at me with that look she had equal parts pride and caution. "That boy knows how to pick a lock," she'd said. "Just make sure it's never yours." She'd meant it lightly. She always meant things lightly, even when she was being serious. I hadn't understood until right now, sitting in this car on this mountain road, exactly what she was warning me about. Declan reached into the door pocket and produced a tablet, a slim, expensive thing that he set on the center console between us, with the practiced casualness of a man producing a document he'd been carrying for exactly this purpose. The screen was already on. The document was already open, not at the beginning, where the preamble and definitions lived, but near the end, at the section marked for signatures. "We had everything drafted," Declan said. "Took months. We wanted to make sure it was airtight." He said the word airtight, the way people say it when they want you to feel that the heavy lifting has already been done, and all that's left for you to do is agree. I picked up the tablet. I read slowly. Line by line, clause by clause, the way I used to read installation specs for high-security vault systems, not looking for what was there, but for what wasn't. What I found in the first 3 pages confirmed what the file name on the center console had already told me back at the gas station. This was not an asset protection plan. This was a transfer of control. Full and immediate and unconditional, every account, every property, every instrument, bundled under a single power of attorney assigned to Declan, effective upon signing with no sunset clause, no independent oversight, no provision for revocation. The document was well written. Whoever had drafted it knew what they were doing, which made it more troubling, not less. Near the bottom of page 4, I noticed the signature authentication interface, a biometric verification panel, built into the tablet's interface. My eyes stayed on it a moment longer than Declan probably expected. I had co-developed the underlying architecture of systems like this one back in 1987, working out of a lab in New Jersey with an engineer named Hans Brenner. I knew the way these systems were built. I knew what they were designed to catch. And I knew in the quiet technical part of my mind that never fully stopped working, that I also knew what they could be made to do if you understood them well enough. I set the tablet down. "I'd like Theodore Marsh to look at this before I sign anything," I said. Theodore had been my attorney for 31 years, a man who had reviewed every significant document in my financial life, and who I trusted more than any person alive except Maggie, and she was gone now. Declan's smile didn't disappear. It just recalibrated. "Dad, Theo's not family. This is a family matter." I didn't answer. Outside, the snow had thickened into something serious. The kind of snow that changes plans. I watched it accumulate along the top of the guardrail and thought about the authentication panel on that tablet, and about the particular way a mechanism behaves when the person who built it is the same person trying to open it. Something had begun to move inside me. Not anger. Something older and quieter than anger. Preparation. The $1,000,000 highway doesn't forgive mistakes. That's what the old-timers always said about US 55. Oh, the stretch of road carved into the San Juan Mountains where the cliffs drop straight down without guardrails, where the asphalt hugs the rock face so closely that a single wrong turn sends you into nothing. I'd driven it twice before, both times with Maggie, both times in summer, when the wildflowers grew gold along the edges and the views made her laugh out loud. Today, in the first week of January, it looked like the edge of the world. Declan switched on the headlights at noon. That told me everything I needed to know about the weather. The storm had rolled in from the west without warning, the way Colorado storms always do, patient, deliberate, then all at once. Snow hammered the windshield in horizontal sheets, and the wipers worked double time to keep pace. In the back seat, Vivian had her phone out, the pale glow of the screen reflecting off her sunglasses, which she still hadn't taken off, despite the near darkness outside. I watched the low clouds swallowing the peaks, one ridge at a time, and thought about the winter Maggie and I came through here with nothing but a thermos of black coffee and a road map from a gas station in Durango. She'd made me pull over just to stand in the snow and listen to how quiet it was. There was no quiet today. "Dad." Declan's voice was measured. He'd been measuring every syllable since we left Denver. "We're coming up on Ouray in about 40 minutes. I'd like this settled before we stop." He held the tablet out toward me without taking his eyes off the road. The document was still open, the same power of attorney draft I'd read twice already, the one with no conditions, no review clause, no sunset date. Just a clean transfer. Everything I'd built over 50 years handed across in a single screen press. "It's straightforward," Vivian said from the back seat, not looking up from her phone. "Theodore's a lovely man, but this is family business. You don't need a third party reviewing what Declan is trying to do for you." I took the tablet. I want to be honest, I wasn't angry. Anger is for people who are surprised. I'd been watching this moment come together the way I used to watch the tumblers inside a combination lock, one by one, each falling into place with a sound too small for most people to hear. I'd heard every one of them. What I felt holding that tablet was closer to clarity. The biometric authentication panel glowed at the bottom of the screen, a clean interface, minimal, professional. To anyone else, it was just a fingerprint reader. To me, it was something I'd helped build from the ground up. In 1993, a regional bank consortium in New Jersey hired my firm to consult on physical-digital security integration. Most of the work was hardware vault mechanisms, access control panels. But one of the junior engineers, a 26-year-old named Forrest Gill, had been developing authentication software that read more than just a fingerprint. It read the angle of the finger's approach, the pressure distribution, the hold duration. I spent 4 months helping Forrest refine the parameters until the system could distinguish between a voluntary signature and a coerced one, between a man signing freely and a man signing under duress. The commercial version that went to market stripped most of that out. Too complex, the client said. Too expensive to maintain. But the original build still existed embedded in the authentication layer of certain legacy documents that had been generated through the consortium's early software licenses, documents like the one Declan was holding. I pressed my right thumb to the panel. 3 degrees. That's all it took, a 3-degree offset from my registered angle, a rotation so small that no one watching could detect it, a deviation that fell below the threshold of any visible tremor. For a man with 50 years of fine motor work, 3 degrees was nothing. It was the space between a lock that opens and a lock that doesn't. The screen processed for 2 seconds. Signature accepted. Declan exhaled. I heard it even over the sound of the storm, a breath released from somewhere deep, the kind that carries more than air. He reached over and took the tablet back, without looking at me, and I watched him set it on the console with the particular carefulness of someone handling something they've already decided belongs to them. What he didn't see was the secondary screen, the one that only appears on authenticated back-end monitors, the one that would have shown in small gray text. A status update being sent to a server in Newark, New Jersey, emergency freeze protocol initiated. Linked accounts suspended. Duration 72 hours. Reversion original authorization holder. The mountain pressed in on both sides. The headlights turned the falling snow into a curtain of white static, and for a long moment, the only sound inside the Range Rover was the engine, the wipers, and Vivian's fingernails tapping against the edge of her phone case. I turned the brass cylinder in my coat pocket, the small antique lock I'd carried for 30 years, the one I used to let Declan hold when he was 8 years old and couldn't sleep. He used to ask me why I always carried a lock with no key. Because the key is the easy part, I'd told him then. Any thief can get a key. The hard part is understanding what the lock is trying to protect. I looked at my son's hands on the steering wheel. Steady, confident, completely unaware. "Declan," I said. How bad is it really? I kept my voice even the way I used to keep it when a client's vault was jammed and I needed them to stop panicking so I could work. "The fund. Tell me the truth." The wipers moved. The snow came down. And Declan's knuckles, I noticed, went just slightly white against the wheel. My question hung in the recycled air of that $60,000 SUV like smoke that had nowhere to go. Declan's knuckles had gone white. Not gradually, instantly, the way a man grips something when he's afraid of what happens if he lets go. I watched his jaw work once, twice, and then stop as if the answer he'd rehearsed had suddenly stopped making sense even to him. In the back seat, Vivian had put her phone face down on her knee. That was the first time she'd done that in 4 hours. I thought of what Maggie used to say about Declan's hands. We'd be at one of his Little League games or watching him in a school debate, and she'd lean close and murmur it without taking her eyes off him. "Watch his hands, Warren. He always gives himself away with his hands." I used to smile when she said it. I'd thought it was just a mother noticing things the way mothers do. Now I understood it was a warning. Why does that matter? Declan's voice came out wrong, too tight, too high, stripped of the careful modulation he'd been maintaining since Denver. "You already signed, Dad. It's done." "I signed something," I said. "I'm not entirely sure it's what you think it is." The Range Rover drifted a half-inch toward the center line before Declan corrected it. Outside, the storm had gone from heavy to absolute. The peaks had vanished entirely. There was no sky, no valley below, no road ahead, just a tunnel of white static and the 2 thin yellow lines of our headlights trying to hold the world together. What is that supposed to mean?" "It means exactly what it sounds like." He hit the steering wheel with the heel of his hand. Once. The sound was flat and final, like a door slamming in an empty house. "Do you know what I've been dealing with?" His voice cracked at the edges now, not from grief, but from something harder and more corrosive. I'd heard that particular crack before 30 years ago, when Declan was 12 and came home from a mathematics competition with second place. He hadn't cried because he was sad. He'd cried in his room for 40 minutes because he was furious. And when Maggie and I listened through the door, we'd told each other it was just healthy competitiveness. We'd been wrong about a lot of things. "Tell me," I said. So he did. The fund had been hemorrhaging since the second quarter of 2024. Bad positions in commercial real estate, ironic given what I owned, and 3 tech bets that evaporated inside of 6 months. $38 million gone, not mismanaged in Declan's telling, stolen by market conditions, betrayed by partners who pulled out at the wrong moment, strangled by interest rates that nobody could have predicted. It was always somebody else's fault. It always had been. "And my investors are circling," he said. "2 of them have already retained lawyers. Do you understand what that means? Do you have any idea what the next 6 months look like for me if I can't?" He stopped, reorganized. The professional mask tried to slide back into place and couldn't quite find purchase. "I needed this settled today, Dad. I needed it simple. I know you did. You've never trusted me." The mask gave up entirely. Not once. Not with the business, not with the money, not with anything that actually mattered. You just sat on that estate like some kind of like a man guarding a vault that nobody else was allowed to touch. I let the silence breathe for a moment before I answered. "It's my vault," I said. "I built it. Your mother and I built it over 50 years, one lock at a time. And I'm sorry that the fund is in trouble. I genuinely am. But that doesn't make what you planned today any less of what it was." "And what was it, Dad? What was it?" His voice had gone ugly now, not loud, but ugly the way a stripped gear sounds when metal grinds against metal without anything to cushion it. "I was trying to protect the family. You were trying to save yourself." From the back seat, Vivian's voice came low and even barely above the sound of the heater. "Declan." A pause, precise and deliberate as a keystroke. "We're losing daylight. Just do it, and let's go." Not fear, not objection, not discomfort, just scheduling. I turned to look at her. She was watching the snow through her window sunglasses, still on her expression, as composed as a woman waiting for a late lunch reservation. There was nothing in her face that resembled conflict. I thought of all the dinners we'd shared, all the holidays in that penthouse she'd redecorated 3 times in 4 years. All the moments I'd told Maggie I thought Vivian was warming up, that she just needed time. Maggie had smiled that particular quiet smile of hers and changed the subject. Declan pulled the Range Rover to the shoulder of the road. On one side, the rock face of the San Juan Mountains went straight up and disappeared into cloud. On the other, there was nothing, just the edge of the asphalt, and then a drop that the snow made invisible. No guardrail, no margin. This section of US 550 had been cut from raw cliff face in the 1920s by workers who hung from ropes. People died building this road, and the mountain had never much cared. "Get out," Declan said. He still wasn't looking at me. "You think you matter enough that I'd bring you along for any other reason? You don't belong in my life anymore." He wasn't looking at me. He was staring straight ahead into the white. "Is this what you want?" I asked. "I want you to say it out loud." He reached past me and pushed my door open. The cold came in like something alive, a wall of it, immediate and indifferent, carrying the smell of pine and ice and altitude. He reached into the back, pulled my old coat from behind the seat, and threw it at me. Not handed through. The way you throw something you've already decided has no value. He didn't check the pockets. That was the thing about Declan. His arrogance was precise. He didn't examine what he dismissed. He never had. I stepped out onto the asphalt. My boot found ice beneath the snow, and I steadied myself against the doorframe, then let go. The wind hit me across the face like a hand, cold and hard and personal. I didn't look back at Declan. I didn't look at Vivian. I stood there on the shoulder of the $1 million highway and listened to the Range Rover's tires find purchase on the snow and pull away, the red taillights bleeding into the white until there was nothing left of them at all, just the dark and the storm and the sound of my own breathing. Then I put my hand in the coat pocket. My fingers closed around something cold and solid, smaller than a brick, heavier than it had any right to be. I already knew what it was. The cold didn't ease its way in. It arrived the way the mountain had always been, absolute indifferent without apology. The moment that car door shut behind me, the storm stopped being weather and became something else entirely. A presence. A weight. The wind came off the San Juans in lateral sheets, not gusting, but sustained, the kind of cold that doesn't bite so much as occupy it, moves into your bones, and makes itself at home. I stood still for a moment, not from shock, from habit. 50 years of working with locks and vaults and security systems in every condition imaginable had taught me one thing before anything else: when a situation turns bad, the worst thing you can do is move before you think. Panic burns calories. Panic wastes oxygen. Panic gets you dead on a mountain in January when your son has just driven away in a $60,000 Range Rover and left you at 9,000 feet with nothing but an old coat and whatever was in its pockets. I thought of the morning in 1987 when a bank in Duluth, Minnesota called me out for an emergency vault release. The walk-in had malfunctioned during a cold snap that dropped the temperature inside to -20. My fingers went numb inside the first 4 minutes. The branch manager had stood behind me, asking the same question every 30 seconds. Can you still do it? Can you still feel anything? I told him the same thing every time: my fingers don't need to feel. They just need to move. I reached into the right pocket of the coat. Empty. A gas station receipt, maybe 2 years old. A button that had come loose from something. I reached into the left pocket. My hand closed around it, rectangular, dense, solid. The rubber casing had gone stiff in the cold, but I knew the shape the way you know a key you've carried for years without looking at it. The Iridium 9575. Satellite phone, 32 ounces, shock-resistant housing, operates independently of terrestrial cell networks. I'd carried one on every remote job for 15 years. When I'd worn this coat last, a security consultation for a pipeline company in Wyoming. 18 months ago, I'd slipped the phone in this pocket the same way I always did, and apparently never moved it. Declan had thrown this coat at me like it was trash. He'd never once considered that the old man might have something in his pockets worth keeping. I pulled the phone out and checked the screen. 40% battery enough. The satellite signal indicator was jumping 2 bars, dropping to 1, dropping to 2 again, as the storm interfered with the low Earth orbit connection. Iridium's network is designed for this. Military-grade polar capable, built for conditions that would kill a standard cell signal in 30 seconds. But even Iridium struggles when a Colorado blizzard is running at full intensity over a mountain pass at 9,000 feet. I tried 911 first. Standard protocol, standard logic. The call attempted 3 times. Each time the connecting tone gave way to static, and then nothing. Not a busy signal, not a rejection, just the particular silence of a connection that has found no path to complete itself. The storm was eating the signal before it could reach the nearest relay. I stood there on the shoulder of US 550 and ran the math. Ouray was roughly 12 miles south, Silverton maybe 15 north. In clear weather with a working phone and my knees from 20 years ago, neither would be a problem. Today, with the snow deepening and the wind chill pushing the effective temperature down toward negative 12 miles, was a number that required respect. I was 72 years old, and I hadn't walked a mountain in winter since Maggie got sick. My boots were good. I'd worn them expecting Colorado in January, regardless of what Declan thought we were doing this weekend. But my gloves were in my other coat, the one hanging in the back of a Range Rover currently somewhere on the south side of this pass. I thought of Ray Kowalski. Ray had been my apprentice for 11 years before he went out on his own. And in the 30 years since we'd stayed close the way men in the trades stay close, not constantly, not emotionally, but reliably. He was 64 years old, ran a small security outfit in Denver, and had the particular quality that I'd always valued in a partner. He didn't require a lot of explanation to understand that something was wrong. 3 days ago, before we left for Colorado, I'd sent him a text. Nothing urgent, just habit. Heading to Colorado with Declan this weekend. Our area. Ray had replied with a thumbs up and a note about the weather forecast. Standard exchange. The kind of thing you do when you've spent decades in a business where people occasionally went to remote places and didn't come back on schedule. I found his number and pressed call. The connection took 11 seconds to establish. I counted, because counting is what you do when your hands are shaking and your mind needs something to do that isn't fear. Then a click, a half second of satellite static, and his voice. Hello. A pause. Boss, that you? Ray. My voice came out rougher than I expected. The cold had already gotten into my throat. Shocked. The wind hit me from the north-northwest harder than anything that had come before it, and I stepped back instinctively. My right boot found ice under the snow. The foot went sideways, and the motion traveled up through my hip and into my arm. And then the phone was gone, not slowly, not dramatically, just suddenly absent from my hand, the way things go absent when gravity makes its case faster than reflex can answer. I watched it hit the asphalt, once bounce and slide. The shoulder of US 550 has no guardrail on the east side at this elevation. The phone crossed the white line, crossed the gravel, and then the mountain took it. I heard it hit something below once, twice, and then nothing. From somewhere in that static-filled satellite distance, barely audible now without the phone against my ear, I heard Ray's voice one last time. Hello, boss. You there? And then the mountain swallowed that too. I stood at the edge and looked down into the white nothing below. The phone was gone. The signal was gone. The only lifeline I'd had to the outside world was 40 feet down a talus slope in a January blizzard, and it was not coming back. I breathed, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way I'd been taught to do in conditions that could kill you, if you let them convince you they already had. Ray had heard 3 things in those few seconds: my voice, which told him I was alive and on a satellite line; the wind, the particular sound of a high-altitude Colorado blizzard that any man who'd spent time in these mountains would recognize; and the sound of a phone falling, then silence, which told him the line hadn't dropped. The line had broken. I didn't know what Ray Kowalski would do with those 3 things. But I knew Ray Kowalski. There is a particular kind of silence that exists only at high altitude in a mountain storm, not an absence of sound, but a fullness of it. Wind at 9,000 feet doesn't howl the way it does in movies. It presses. It fills every available space between the rocks and the snowpack and your coat and your skin, and it does so with the steady, impersonal authority of something that has been doing this for 10,000 years and has never once been interrupted. I started walking south. Not because south was certain, because south was the only direction that offered any mathematics worth respecting. Ore sat somewhere below this pass, 12 miles by road, maybe less as the terrain fell away. I'd worked a job in the San Juan Basin in 2009. A private mineral rights company needed their server room secured against altitude-related hardware failure. And I'd driven this stretch of US 550 three times that week. I remembered the mile markers, the way I remembered lock combinations, not by trying, but because my mind had cataloged them automatically. The way it always cataloged things that might matter later. Mile marker 97 was where I'd lost the satellite signal on the drive up, which meant I was standing somewhere between 97 and 101, closer to 97, based on the time elapsed since we'd entered the worst of the pass. The nearest Colorado State Patrol emergency pull-off was at 95.4, and I was reasonably sure there was a Forest Service maintenance road at 94 that connected to a ranger outpost. 2 to 3 miles. In clear weather, 40 minutes. In this weather, with Oxford-soled dress shoes and no gloves, the calculation required adjustments I preferred not to make too precisely. I kept walking, the secret to working in extreme cold, and I had worked in it more than once. More than most people ever have reason to, is that you must never allow your body to convince your mind that the situation has already been decided. The body is a poor forecaster. It reports current conditions and extrapolates catastrophe. The mind, if you let it, can do something the body cannot. It can work the problem. Every lock has a weakness. Every situation has a way out. Find it before the panic finds you. I'd told that to a dozen apprentices over the years. I'd told it to Ray Kowalski in a parking garage in Chicago in 1991, when he was 29 years old and had just locked himself out of a client's entire access control system with 40 minutes until the client arrived. He'd looked at me like I'd offered him a fortune cookie instead of advice. Then he'd gone back to the panel and found the override port in 11 minutes. I thought about what Ray would do now. I didn't know, not precisely, not in the way that omniscience works in stories. I could only reason from what I knew of him, which was considerable. Ray Kowalski had spent 30 years in security work, which meant 30 years of being the person people called when something had gone wrong in a place that was hard to reach. He was methodical in the specific way that good security men become methodical, not rigid, but habitual with habits that had been tested under pressure and refined until they worked. He would replay the call. 3 seconds of audio, maybe 4, my voice saying his name, the particular sound of the wind, the fall, the silence. He would know it wasn't a dropped call. A dropped call sounds like a door closing. What he'd heard sounded like a door being torn off its hinges. He would go back to my text message from 3 days ago. Heading to Colorado with Declan this weekend. Ouray area. 3 words of location, Ouray area, which on a map of Colorado narrows the universe considerably. Ouray sits at the end of one road going north and one road going south, and that road is US 550. There is no other option. A man who has spent 30 years thinking about access points and egress routes looks at a map of Ouray and sees immediately that the only road in is the only road out. He would call the Colorado State Patrol dispatch for Ouray County. He would ask whether any vehicles had been found stopped or abandoned on US 550 between Ouray and Silverton. If yes, he'd have a location. If no, he'd have a frame of reference. Either way, he'd be moving before the call was finished. I was not certain of any of this. I was reasoning from character, which is the only intelligence available to a man walking alone on a mountain at dusk. But I had known Ray Kowalski for 33 years, and in 33 years, he had never once waited for more information than he already had. I kept walking. Left boot, right boot, left boot, measuring each step for ice beneath the snow, keeping my center of gravity low, staying on the inner shoulder of the road, where the asphalt crown shed some of the accumulation. My hands had gone from painful to numb, which in one sense was worse, and in another sense was manageable. Numb hands can still grip. Numb hands can still work if they know what they're doing. The light appeared without warning. Not dawn headlights coming north up the grade, moving carefully, the high beams cutting the snowfall into 1,000 individual trajectories. I stepped to the center of the lane and raised both arms. Not frantically, deliberately, arms straight out from the shoulders, the universal shape of a man asking the universe to stop. The truck stopped. It was a Ford F-250 with a Colorado Parks and Wildlife decal on the door and a light bar across the roof that wasn't currently running. The window came down, and a man in his early 40s looked at me with the expression of someone who was not entirely surprised to find a problem on this road on a night like this. He had on a brown Parks uniform and a wool hat pulled low, and he held a radio in one hand, as though he'd been in the middle of a call. "Sir." He looked me up and down the Oxford shoes, the thin coat, the absence of winter gear. "How long have you been out here?" "About 2 hours," I said. "Maybe a bit more." He leaned across and pushed the passenger door open. "Get in." I got in. The heat hit me across the face like something physical, a wall of it, warm and dry and immediate. And I sat there for a moment, just breathing it in, while the ranger pulled a radio call to dispatch reporting a recovered individual on US 550 northbound. Mile marker 94, condition stable. He handed me a thermos without ceremony. Black coffee the way people in mountain stations keep it. "You want to tell me what happened?" he said. Not unkind, just efficient. "In a moment," I said. "First, I need to borrow your phone." He studied me for a second, then handed it over without further question. The way people who work emergencies learn to operate, reading urgency from tone rather than waiting for explanation. I held it in hands that were just beginning to remember what feeling was. I looked out the passenger window one last time at the road north, at the white corridor of the pass where 2 red taillights had dissolved into a blizzard 3 hours ago. Then I turned back to the screen. 2 calls. The order mattered more than the calls themselves. The ranger station was smaller than most people's living rooms. A wood stove in the corner throwing orange heat. A folding table with a laminated topo map pinned under a coffee maker. 2 metal chairs, a wall of hooks holding orange vests and carabiners, and a window that showed nothing but darkness and the white static of falling snow. The ranger, his name tag said Briggs, though he hadn't introduced himself, was filling a second mug without being asked. His back to me in the particular way that people in emergency professions learn to give you space without leaving the room. I dialed Ray. He picked up before the second ring. "Warren?" Not a question. His voice had the texture of a man who has been holding his breath for the better part of an hour. "Thank God. I've been driving for 40 minutes. "I know," I said. "Where are you?" "South of Montrose on 550. Road's bad but passable. I had to take the Cimarron cutoff. The direct route north of Ridgeway had ice reports." A pause, and I heard the sound of tires on packed snow, the muffled percussion of a truck running hard in winter conditions. "How are you doing? Are you hurt?" "Cold." "Not hurt. I'm at a ranger station south of mile marker 94. A Parks and Wildlife officer found me on the road." Another pause. When Ray spoke again, I could hear something in his voice settling, not relief exactly, but a recalibration, the sound of a man shifting from emergency mode into operational mode. 2 different gears, and Ray had always been good at finding them quickly. "Okay," he said. "I'm maybe an hour out. Maybe more if the road stays like this. Just stay put. I'm not going anywhere." I looked at Ranger Briggs's Oxford-soled shoes still sitting near the wood stove with snow melting off the welt. He'd lent me a pair of wool socks without being asked. "Tell me how you found me." 3 steps, Ray said, and I could hear the economy in it, the habit of a man who gives briefings. When the call dropped, I knew it wasn't a technical disconnect. Your signal had been holding. Something happened on your end. So I replayed what I heard your voice, which told me you were alive and mobile. Wind, not city wind, not plains wind. Mountain wind, high altitude, the kind you get on exposed passes above 8,000 feet. And then the sound of the phone going. Not static, not a pocket fumble, something falling. Go on. So I went back to your text. Colorado with Declan Ure area. That's it, that's the whole geography. Ure is a box canyon. One road in, one road out, and it's 550. I called Ouray County Sheriff first. They had nothing. Then I called the two ranger stations on the 550 corridor north and south. The southern station picked up on the second ring and said a parks officer had just called in a recovered male older at mile marker 94. He paused. 3 steps, 28 minutes from the time the call dropped. I sat with that for a moment. Over 3 decades, that was how long I had known Ray Kowalski, since he was a 27-year-old with a junior security license and a habit of over-explaining his reasoning out loud, which had driven his previous supervisor half insane, and which I had always found useful because a man who explains his reasoning can be taught, and a man who can be taught eventually stops needing to be managed. He'd called me boss since the first week, and never stopped even after he went out on his own, even after his outfit grew to 30 employees and a 6-figure annual retainer with a Denver hospital system. Old habits. 1 hour, I said. I'll be here. Don't go anywhere cold, he said, and hung up. Ranger Briggs set the second mug on the table near my elbow without comment. I nodded once and picked it up. The second call required a different kind of preparation. Theodore Marsh and I had known each other for 31 years, since a seminar on physical-digital security integration at Columbia University in 1994, where he'd been the only attorney in the room and I'd been the only locksmith, and we'd spent an hour afterward arguing about liability frameworks for biometric data. We'd been arguing with increasing affection ever since. He was 71 years old, still practiced full-time at the firm he'd built in Lower Manhattan, and had the particular quality that I had always valued in counsel: he was impossible to rattle. I dialed his office line. It was nearly 9 o'clock on a Friday night in January. He answered on the third ring. Warren. His voice was the same as was measured slightly dry, the voice of a man who has heard everything and been surprised by very little of it. This is an unusual hour. I know. I need 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. A silence of perhaps 2 seconds. I had learned long ago that Theodore's silences were not gaps, they were calculations. What am I preparing? He said. Everything. The trust documents, the asset freeze confirmation, the power of attorney revocation. Everything we discussed 18 months ago when I said I hoped I'd never need it. Another silence. Shorter this time. Are you safe? I'm at a ranger station on US 550. Ray Kowalski is on his way. 8 o'clock, Theodore said. I'll have it ready. Theodore. I paused. There was something I needed him to understand without my having to explain it in full, not on a borrowed phone in a ranger station with walls thin enough to carry conversation. The document was signed tonight, under the protocol. A beat. One single beat, and then, I see. That was all. He didn't ask which protocol or what document or how. He'd helped me build the security architecture around that estate for 3 decades. He understood what under the protocol meant, the same way a man understands the click of a lock he himself has helped design. 8 o'clock, I said again. Good night, Warren. I set the phone on the table. Outside, the storm had not relented. The wood stove ticked in the corner the way wood stoves do when the fire inside them is finding new material. And I sat with both hands around the mug and let the warmth work its way back into my fingers, joint by joint. Ranger Briggs had pulled a folding chair up to the topo map and was marking something with a pen, road conditions probably, or closures. He hadn't asked me a single follow-up question since I'd told him I needed to make 2 calls. Good man. I watched the snow against the window and thought about the morning. Theodore's office on a Saturday, the documents laid out on his mahogany table, the pen in my hand. There were things that needed to happen in a specific order, and the order was not complicated once you understood the mechanics. A good locksmith always works the mechanism before he works the lock. I had been working this mechanism for longer than Declan knew. Nearly 2 hours later, the road south of Ridgeway had been worse than Ray anticipated, black ice under fresh powder. The kind of combination that catches even experienced drivers. A pair of headlights appeared in the ranger station window. Not a truck. A Ford F-150, older navy blue, moving carefully up the access road with the deliberate pace of someone who knows exactly where he's going and sees no reason to hurry now that he's arrived. I stood up. I have been in locked vaults in sub-zero temperatures. I have stood on rooftops in February to access equipment rooms that had no business being that far from the ground. I have opened doors in conditions that would make most men reconsider the career entirely. I had never in my life seen a vehicle look as good as that old Ford looked coming through the snow. Ray didn't say anything for the first 10 minutes. That was how I knew he was angry. Not at me. Ray had never been angry at me in 33 years, not really, not in the way that leaves marks. But he was holding something back. I could see it in the line of his jaw and the way his hands sat on the wheel of that old Ford, not gripping exactly, but present in a way that hands aren't when a man is just driving. He was keeping himself busy with the road so he wouldn't have to decide what to say first. The Colorado Rockies fell away behind us in the side mirror, the peaks lost to cloud and darkness. And I watched them go with the particular feeling of a man leaving a place he has no intention of returning to in the same condition he arrived. The heater was running full, and the cab smelled like coffee from a gas station cup sitting in the holder between us, long since gone cold. I thought of Maggie. She would not have been surprised. That was the thing about Maggie that I had spent 30 years trying to understand and never quite managed. She saw the shape of things before they happened, not as prophecy, not as intuition exactly, but as a kind of patient attention to the way people moved when they thought no one was watching. She had watched Declan that way for years. I had seen her do it. I had told myself she was being protective in the way mothers are finding threats in normal behavior. She had seen this coming before I had admitted it was possible. How bad, Ray said. 10 minutes on the dot. I had been counting without meaning to. Bad enough, I said. Give me the version without the edits. So I did. 3 minutes, maybe 4, the file on the tablet, the document in the car, the road on US 550, and the snow and the jacket thrown at me like something that had outlived its usefulness. I kept it factual the way I'd learned to give briefings in 30 years of client work events, sequence consequence. No commentary. Ray listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I'd always valued about him. He'd learned early that interrupting a briefing doesn't speed it up. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. The jacket, he said. Yes. He didn't check. No. Ray exhaled through his nose, a single breath, short and controlled. It was the closest he came in my experience to expressing an opinion about someone else's intelligence. What else did you have on you? There's something else, I said. Before the trip 3 days ago, when I first saw the estate file on Declan's tablet, I went to the garage and spent about 20 minutes with the Range Rover. Ray glanced at me. Just a look brief, then back to the road. It was my car, I said. Technically. I bought it in 2021 and transferred usage to Declan. The title was still in my name until last April, and even now the insurance carries my secondary designation as owner of record. I had a Hawk Micro V2 unit in my kit, the kind we used on the Meridian Capital job in 2019 when the client needed interior documentation in a mobile environment. Ray would know what the Hawk Micro V2 was. We'd used 4 of them on that contract, small magnetic mount audio recording devices with cellular upload capability. When the device detected a Wi-Fi or 4G signal, it automatically transmitted its recorded files to a designated secure server. Plug and play, designed for exactly the kind of situation where you needed documentation and couldn't rely on being present to collect it manually. Under the driver's seat, I said. Magnetic mount on the frame. It recorded everything from the moment Declan started the car in Denver. And uploaded to Theodore's server. The moment the car entered a signal zone, which would have been sometime this afternoon when Declan came back down off the pass. Ray was quiet again. The highway ran straight ahead of us, the headlights catching snowflakes in horizontal trajectories, the mile markers going by in steady rhythm. New York law, he said. It wasn't a question, but it was. One-party consent. New York Penal Law Section 250.05, recording a conversation is lawful when at least one party to that conversation consents. I was in that car for the first 6 hours of the drive. I was a party. I consented. I paused. And even setting that aside, the device was installed in my own vehicle. The legal framework for recording in a property you own is cleaner than most people realize. For civil use, Ray said. For civil use, I confirmed. Theodore will know what to do with it. Ray nodded once, the way he nods when a plan has been presented to him, and he finds it structurally sound. He didn't say good or well done or anything that would have made it feel smaller than it was. He just nodded and kept driving, and I felt for the first time since noon something that might have been the beginning of solid ground. I laid out the rest of it, the freeze already in motion, Theodore's 8 o'clock appointment, the locksmith for the penthouse, the asset documentation. 4 steps, each one following from the last, the way tumblers follow in a combination lock. The right sequence produces the opening every time without fail, as long as you don't rush the mechanism. Ray listened. When I finished, he said, and Declan doesn't know any of it. He knows the signature was accepted, I said. That's all. We crossed into the Kansas corridor, the elevation dropping, the snowpack thinning at the roadside. The cab was warm and the road was empty, and I let my eyes rest on the darkness outside for a while without trying to make sense of it. Ray's phone buzzed on the dash mount. I reached over and read the notification, a banking system alert sent to my emergency backup contact number, which Ray had held for 11 years. Emergency freeze protocol activated. All linked accounts suspended pending review. Confirmation code 7741. I set the phone back on the mount. It's done, Ray, I said. He didn't say anything. He just drove, but I saw his shoulders drop 1/4 of an inch. The release of a man who has been bracing for a long time against something uncertain and has just been told it's over. Outside, the last of the Colorado mountains disappeared behind us into the dark. There are rooms that exist outside of time. Theodore Marsh's office on the 28th floor of a lower Manhattan building was one of them. Dark walnut shelving from floor to ceiling, filled with the kind of law volumes that exist to be consulted rather than read. Their spines worn at the tops, where decades of hands had pulled them down and replaced them. A mahogany desk wide enough to land a small aircraft. 2 windows facing south, the harbor visible in the distance through morning fog. And between them, a framed copy of the New York State Bar admission certificate dated 1977, the year I had just opened my second shop in Brooklyn, and Declan had been 9 years old, and the world had seemed briefly like something that made complete sense. Theodore was already at the desk when I arrived. He did not look like a man who had been up since before 6 on a Saturday morning. He looked the way he always looked, composed in the particular way, of someone who has spent 47 years learning to present a surface that reveals nothing until he decides to reveal it. He had on a gray suit and a tie the color of old pewter, and there was a single manila folder open on the desk in front of him, and 3 additional folders stacked to the right, edges aligned to the millimeter. He stood when I came in, and we shook hands the way we had been shaking hands for 31 years, firmly, briefly, without the additions that lesser occasions sometimes require. "Sit down, Warren," he said. I sat. The mahogany surface under my fingertips was cool and solid, and I let my hand rest there for a moment before I pulled it back. The last time I had sat in this exact chair, Maggie had been in the one beside me. We'd come to update our joint estate documents, a routine review, nothing urgent. The kind of appointment that responsible people with significant assets make every few years to ensure that the architecture of their lives remains sound. She'd worn a blue coat and had a coffee from the place on the corner. And when Theodore had walked us through the beneficiary designations, she'd reached over and put her hand over mine without comment. The way she did when something mattered to her, and words seemed beside the point. She would have found today satisfying, I thought. Not pleasant, she had never taken satisfaction in conflict, but she had understood better than I had for a long time that there are moments when the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop protecting them from the consequences of their own choices. "You heard the file," I said. It was not a question. I heard it," Theodore said. He moved the first folder to the center of the desk. "Last night around 11, I listened to the relevant portions twice." He paused, one of his deliberate, calculating pauses. It was thorough. Declan is detailed when he thinks no one is listening. He is. Theodore opened the folder. "Let's begin." The first document was the formal revocation of the electronic estate transfer instrument that Declan had presented on the tablet. Theodore walked me through it in the clipped, precise way he walked through everything, not rushing, not over-explaining. Each clause read aloud with the same weight given to every line regardless of whether it seemed significant. I had never been a man who signed documents without reading them, and Theodore had never once suggested I hurry. That mutual understanding was one of the foundations of 31 years. The second document established the Maggie Holt Memorial Trust. Irrevocable. Sole lifetime trustee Warren James Holt. Successor trustee, a name I'd chosen 2 months ago when I'd first asked Theodore to prepare these documents before the weekend, before the tablet on the console, before any of this had moved from possibility to fact, was Ray Kowalski. The trust held all primary assets, the real estate portfolio, the watch collection, the patent royalties, the liquid holdings. No secondary beneficiary had access to any of it without a judicial order, and the conditions for such an order were written to be, in Theodore's phrasing, jurisdictionally resistant. He had enjoyed writing that clause, I could tell. The third document was the formal freeze notice, not a duplicate of what the banking system had processed electronically the night before, but something of a different order entirely. The protocol freeze was technical temporary, 72 hours by design. This document made the suspension permanent, grounded in trust authority rather than authentication software, and enforceable by any court in the state of New York, regardless of what happened to the underlying system. All accounts in which Declan Holt held any designated access were flagged for immediate suspension, with a formal notice of cause to be delivered to him by registered mail. The fourth was the penthouse. "I spoke with the building's general counsel at 7 this morning," Theodore said, moving to the fourth folder. "We had 10 minutes of conversation. He reviewed the trust certification I sent him at 6:45 and confirmed the building's compliance posture." He set a single page in front of me. "The property at the relevant address is owned by a holding entity that I helped you structure in 2018. That entity is now wholly subsumed under the Maggie Holt Memorial Trust, of which you are the sole trustee. The building has been informed that the current occupants, Declan and Vivian Holt, are no longer authorized residents. On what grounds? Trespassing under the Trust's access revocation provision, which I drafted in 2018 to include a clause for serious breach of fiduciary or ethical obligation. He looked at me over the top of his reading glasses. What Declan did on that highway qualifies, unambiguously. Timeline. The building's facilities manager will have the access system updated by noon. Fingerprint registry removed key fob codes reset. The current residents will receive formal notice via the building's management office also by noon. I picked up the pen. I have signed thousands of documents in my life. Contracts, certifications, client agreements, deed transfers. Each one was a mechanism of its own, a lock being set, a door being defined, a boundary being drawn between what was and what would be. These four felt different, not heavier exactly, more permanent. The kind of signature that closes something in a way that cannot be reopened without significant effort from people who will not be inclined to make it. I signed each one, slowly, completely, without hesitation. Theodore gathered them, aligned the edges, and set them in a separate stack with the careful efficiency of a man who has handled consequential paperwork for half a century. He uncapped his own pen, added his witness signature to the appropriate lines, and then set the pen down. He looked at me for a moment. "There is one more thing," he said. "Regarding Declan's fund, I found something this morning that I think you'll want to see before you leave." He reached to the left side of the desk and pulled a fifth folder from beneath the others, thinner than the rest, the tab labeled only with a string of letters and numbers that meant nothing to me at first glance. He opened it and slid it across the desk. I looked at the first page. At the top, in standard corporate filing font, was a company name. I knew that name, not because I had forgotten it, because I had seen it before, in a context so different from this one that for a moment my mind could not reconcile the two. The way you feel when you encounter a key in a drawer you don't remember owning, for a lock you can't immediately place. I looked up at Theodore. His expression had not changed. He was watching me the way he always watched me when he wanted to know if I had already arrived at the same place he had. Before I tell you who actually owned the company that lent Declan that $8 million, drop a number in the comments. Any number. 1 digit, 2 digits, doesn't matter. Just let me know you're still here. A note. Before we continue, the chapters ahead include some fictional elements woven in for storytelling purposes. Names, certain details, and specific sequences have been shaped for the screen. If that changes things for you, no pressure to stay. But if you're curious where this goes, keep watching. The company name on the first page of that folder was Ironclad Capital Management. I stared at it for a moment. The way you stare at something familiar in an unfamiliar context. A face you recognize but can't immediately place. A key you know you own but can't remember which lock it belongs to. 15 years. In 15 years, I had not needed to think about Ironclad Capital Management, had not had occasion to recall the 6 months Theodore and I had spent constructing it layer by careful layer, in the aftermath of a financial collapse that had made me understand, with a clarity I hadn't possessed before, exactly how fragile the architecture of wealth could be when the wrong people decided to test it. "Tell me," I said. Theodore folded his hands on the desk in the way that meant he was about to deliver information he found professionally unsatisfying. Not because it was unclear, but because clarity in this case carried a particular kind of weight. 4 weeks ago, Declan Holt approached Ironclad Capital Management for an emergency bridge loan. $8 million, 24% annual interest, 90-day term. He paused. The application was processed through the standard intake procedure. The loan manager, who knows nothing about the ownership structure above his level, reviewed the application, found it satisfactory, and forwarded it to the approval committee, which you sit on. Which I chair, Theodore said. In my capacity as counsel to the Delaware LLC, I approved it 6 days ago. I looked at him. I didn't know it was Declan, he said. When I confirmed the connection this morning, I recused myself from any further ironclad decisions related to this loan. The approval stands. It was made in good faith under standard procedure, but I will not participate in any enforcement action on the lender's side. And his voice had the particular evenness of a man making a factual statement under conditions that make factual statements feel inadequate. The application came through a corporate intermediary, his fund's legal entity, not his personal name. I had no reason to run a beneficial ownership check on a standard bridge loan applicant. He allowed a silence of approximately 2 seconds. I ran one this morning. The autumn of 2008 came back to me in the specific way that formative decisions come back, not as a narrative but as a set of sensations. The particular quality of the light in Theodore's office that October, the way the financial news had felt less like information and more like weather, and the conversation we'd had after I'd watched 3 colleagues lose estates they'd spent lifetimes building because the structures around them hadn't been designed to withstand the kind of pressure that a genuine crisis generates. I need something invisible, Theo, I'd told him. Not a trust, not a will. Something they can't see coming. He had spent 6 months on it. A Delaware LLC at the surface, incorporated with a registered agent and a clean operating history. The Dito LLC, owned by a Nevada statutory trust itself, structured to obscure its beneficiary designations under Nevada's trust privacy statutes. And at the center of that structure, visible only to Theodore and to me, Warren James Holt, sole beneficiary. Ironclad had operated as a legitimate private lending firm for 15 years. Small portfolio, conservative underwriting, nothing that would attract scrutiny. It existed to be real enough that no one would look past it, and invisible enough that what lay behind it could never be reached by anyone who didn't already know where to look. Declan had known to look for emergency capital. He hadn't known to look at who was providing it. He didn't do the research, I said. He couldn't afford to. Theodore turned to the second page of the folder. His fund's primary positions began deteriorating in Q2 of last year. By September, he was managing a $38 million deficit against a fund of roughly $60 million at peak. His institutional investors, 3 of them, had initiated preliminary legal consultations by November. He needed bridge capital before the end of Q1 2025, or the fund would face a forced liquidation event. He looked up. A man in that position does not spend 3 weeks on due diligence. He spends 3 days. And Ironclad looked clean. Ironclad is clean. Registered, compliant, audited, annually 5-year lending history with no defaults. At the surface level, which is all Declan examined, it is exactly what it appears to be: a mid-sized private lending firm operating out of Delaware with a New York business address. Theodore turned another page. He had his fund's attorney review the loan agreement. The attorney checked Ironclad's registration, confirmed the firm's licensure, reviewed the contract terms, and signed off. The attorney didn't go deeper. The attorney billed 4 hours at $400 an hour. Theodore's tone remained level. 4 hours is not enough time to trace a Delaware LLC through a Nevada statutory trust to its ultimate beneficial owner, particularly when there is no reason from the attorney's perspective to suspect that such a search would produce anything other than a conventional holding company. I turned to the third page. The loan agreement was 3 pages of standard commercial lending language with the collateral specification on page 2. I found the collateral line and read it. He used the penthouse, I said. He listed it as primary collateral, yes. He doesn't own the penthouse. No, Theodore said. He does not. The property is held by the 2018 holding entity, which transferred into the Maggie Holt Memorial Trust at 9:47 this morning. He removed his reading glasses and set them on the desk. The collateral designation is therefore void. The loan itself remains valid, ironclad extended funds in good faith, based on representations made by the borrower. But the security interest in the property is unenforceable, which means that when the 90-day term expires and the fund cannot repay, it's an unsecured debt against an insolvent borrower. Theodore placed the folder flat on the desk. Yes. I sat with that for a moment. My son had spent weeks engineering a plan to take $85 million from me, and in the process of doing it, he had borrowed $8 million from me to finance the attempt. He had pledged as collateral an apartment he had never owned. He had signed a contract with a company that answered through 4 layers of legal architecture to the man he'd left standing in a snowstorm at 9,000 feet. I did not feel triumph. I want to be clear about that. What I felt was closer to the sensation I had experienced once years ago when I'd been called to examine a vault that a client believed had been compromised. I'd spent 4 hours on it and found nothing, no forced entry, no sign of tampering. And then I'd stepped back and looked at the whole mechanism from a distance and seen very clearly that the vault had never been the target. The person who'd commissioned the examination had wanted me focused on the vault, while the real exposure happened somewhere else entirely. The difference here was that Declan had been looking at the wrong lock the entire time, and the lock he'd been ignoring had been sitting in plain sight. I reached for my coat. Make sure, I said, that when he finds that penthouse, it's as empty as the promises he's been making his investors. I checked my watch. 10:04. Is there anything else I need to sign before I go? No, Theodore said. Everything is in motion. I buttoned my coat. Then I have a locksmith to meet, I said. And he charges by the hour. The elevator opened on the 47th floor at 12 minutes past noon, and the 3 of us stepped into a foyer that cost more to furnish than my first house. I knew the apartment, of course. I'd bought it in 2017, purchased it through the same holding entity that Theodore had helped me structure, the one that had existed for the singular purpose of being a clean, well-documented asset that could be passed on without complication. The building was on the east side of Midtown, 47 floors of glass and engineered steel, the kind of address that appears in the background of photographs rather than in the conversation. I'd let Declan and Vivian move in 18 months after the purchase. When Declan had made his pitch about Manhattan being essential to his fund's networking operations, and I'd seen no reason to argue the point. The apartment was paid for. The property taxes were handled through a management account. Let them use it. That had been, in retrospect, a more complicated decision than it appeared. The building's property manager was a compact, efficient man in his early 50s named Garrett, who had met us in the lobby with a clipboard and an expression suggesting he had dealt with situations of this kind before and found them professionally manageable rather than personally troubling. Beside me was a paralegal from Theodore's office, a woman in her 30s whose name I had been told and promptly filed away under unnecessary details, carrying a leather portfolio that held the relevant documentation in tabbed order. Mr. Holt! Garrett shook my hand in the foyer. I spoke with Mr. Marsh's office this morning. We have the trust certification, the access revocation order, and the trespassing notification on file. The unit is currently unoccupied. He checked his clipboard. Your team is already inside. I nodded, and he stepped aside. The apartment was large by any standard and extravagant by most. The entry foyer alone was bigger than the first shop I'd rented in Brooklyn. In 1975, 1,200 square feet of open floor plan visible from the door. Floor-to-ceiling windows on the south wall giving a view of the Midtown skyline in winter fog, the kind of view that becomes the reason for the purchase price rather than an amenity. The furniture was the sort you select from a portfolio, rather than a showroom low-profile geometric expensive in the specific way that conveys the absence of budget as a consideration. I stood in the middle of the living room and looked at it. There was nothing here that Maggie would have chosen. That wasn't a criticism exactly. Maggie's tastes had been different from mine in most respects. Warmer and more particular. The kind of aesthetic that comes from actually living in spaces rather than designing them for impression. But this room had been put together by people who saw a home as a statement rather than a place to be. And the result was a space that communicated wealth with perfect efficiency and communicated nothing else at all. The locksmith team was already at work on the secondary entrance. 2 men from a firm I'd used for corporate contracts, reliable, efficient, no conversation required. The primary access system on the 47th floor was a 3-factor setup fingerprint reader proximity fob and a physical deadbolt with a patented keyway. All 3 needed to go. I watched the team work for a few minutes, then walked to the primary door. "I'll handle the deadbolt," I said. The lead technician looked at me, then at my hands, and something shifted in his expression. Hands tell a story to people who know what to look for. Mine had been telling the same story for 50 years. The particular calluses at the base of the index and middle fingers from grip work, the way the knuckles sit from years of fine motor engagement, the steadiness that comes not from youth, but from repetition so complete it has become something close to permanent. "Yes, sir," he said, and handed me the installation kit without further discussion. The lock I'd selected for this door was a Medico M3, with a restricted keyway, one of the highest security residential deadbolts available in the American market. The kind of lock that requires a court order and a skilled locksmith to defeat non-destructively, and that I had recommended to 3 separate clients in the past decade. The installation process is not complicated for someone who has done it 10,000 times. You clear the existing hardware, prepare the bore seat, the new mechanism test, the throw, calibrate the plate alignment. 12 minutes if you know what you're doing. I did it in 9. There is something about returning to craft after a long time away that is difficult to describe accurately. It isn't sentiment exactly. It's more like the particular clarity that comes when you stop thinking about a thing and simply do it. When the hands remember what the mind has been carrying and take over without being asked. I've read that surgeons experience something similar. That musicians do. I wouldn't know about those. I only know locks, and I know that for 9 minutes in the 47th floor hallway of a building in Midtown Manhattan, nothing else required my attention. The throw seated cleanly. The plate alignment was exact to the millimeter. I straightened up and tested the key once, twice, 3 times. Smooth resistance on the engagement, clean release on the retraction. The way it should feel when everything is in its proper place. Garrett prepared 3 key receipts and I signed for all 3. The first key went into my coat pocket. The second went into the leather portfolio the paralegal was holding. The third went into a small envelope that Garrett sealed and initialed to be held in the building's management safe until further notice. I walked back through the living room toward the elevator. At the threshold, I stopped and looked back one final time. The winter light from the south windows fell across the room in long, pale rectangles, catching the dust that the morning's activity had stirred up, small motes moving slowly through the air above furniture that had been chosen by people who would not, after today, be choosing anything in this space again. I stepped out. The door clicked behind me. The elevator arrived in 12 seconds. I stepped in the paralegal beside me and pressed L for the lobby. The doors closed, and we began to descend. Somewhere around the 32nd floor, my phone vibrated. A text from Theodore. Vivian's cards declined. All of them. At the Fifth Avenue Charitable Winter Gala. Effective as of this moment. I read it twice. 47 floors of glass and engineered steel moving steadily downward around me, the city visible in fragments through the elevator's narrow window. I didn't smile. I pressed the lobby button once more, unnecessary a habit, and gave a single slight nod to no one in particular. Right on time. I wasn't there. I want to be precise about that, because what follows is reconstructed, assembled from what Theodore told me on the phone 2 hours later, from what one of the building's management contacts reported to the paralegal, and from 10 years of watching Vivian Holt operate in social environments with the focused precision of a woman who understood that certain rooms were currencies, and that her value in those rooms depended entirely on the performance she delivered inside them. I know Vivian well enough to fill in the details Theodore didn't have. 10 years is a long time to watch someone. I had watched her at family dinners and charity events and quiet Sundays in the penthouse, and what I had learned slowly, with the reluctant clarity of a man who wanted to see something different, was that Vivian Holt was most fully herself in rooms like the Plaza's Grand Ballroom on a Saturday afternoon in January. The Fifth Avenue Charitable Winter Gala was exactly the kind of event she lived for. Black tie, 800 guests, 3 senators, and a former UN secretary on the program. The kind of philanthropy that announces itself with crystal chandeliers and a catering contract that costs more per plate than most Americans spend on groceries in a month. Vivian had attended it for 6 consecutive years. She had, according to Theodore's contact at the event management firm, purchased a table for 8 at $20,000 per seat, charged to a Holt account, and arrived in a car service that let her out at the Fifth Avenue entrance where the photographers were stationed. She was wearing, Theodore told me, the Hermes Himalayan Birkin she'd purchased in November. Matte white crocodile. $150,000 retail, assuming you could find one at retail, which almost nobody can. I know, because I had seen the invoice in a stack of household expenses Declan had forwarded me in December, accompanied by a note suggesting I might want to consider supplementing the household account. I had not supplemented the household account. The first card was presented at the silent auction registration table where guests who wanted to bid on the evening's charitable lots, a week in the Maldives, a private dinner with a celebrity chef. Several pieces of art, I'm told, were by names that mean something to people who follow. Such things were required to register a payment method. Standard procedure at events of this kind. The terminal declined it. Vivian, according to Theodore, did not visibly react. She had the particular poise of a woman who has spent a decade in rooms where visible reaction is considered poor form, and she simply retrieved the card, returned it to the interior of the Birkin, and produced a second one. Black. Metal. The kind of card that is meant to signal by its physical weight alone that the question of payment is a formality rather than a concern. The terminal declined it too. At this point, Theodore said the event manager, a careful, professionally neutral man, whose entire professional skill set involves solving problems without creating scenes, stepped in. Quietly, discreetly, in a voice calibrated to travel approximately 4 feet in any direction and no further. The problem was that the room was quiet enough and the tables close enough that 4 feet was sufficient. Mrs. Holt, he said Theodore's contact had been near enough to hear it. I'm very sorry. The financial institution has a freeze on the accounts associated with these cards. I'm not able to process any transactions against them at this time. The freeze appears to have been initiated today at the request of the account holder of record. The account holder of record. Not a court order, those take time, require filings, leave a paper trail that moves at judicial speed. What Theodore had arranged this morning was faster and cleaner. A formal written instruction from the sole lifetime trustee of the Maggie Holt Memorial Trust myself to the financial institutions, holding the linked accounts, directing an immediate suspension of all secondary access. The institutions had complied by 11 that morning. The cards had been active until then and inactive from that moment forward. Vivian produced a third card. She did not, Theodore said, appear flustered. She appeared very still, which in his experience and mine is what composed people look like, just before they are no longer composed. The terminal declined it. I have met in 50 years of professional life very few people who have no resources available to them in a genuinely difficult moment. Vivienne was not one of them. She had a phone. She had contacts. She had presumably some amount of cash which people who carry $150,000 handbags sometimes do not. What she did not have was a way to make the next 4 minutes disappear. The table to her left held 3 women she had dined with monthly for 4 years. The table to her right held a couple whose charity gala Vivian had chaired 2 years prior. The auction registration table was positioned as these things often are at events with significant donors directly inside the main entrance, visible from essentially every seat in the room. She took out her phone and called Declan. He didn't answer. She called again. He didn't answer the second time either, which I understood, because at approximately the same moment, my phone had received a text from the building's overnight security supervisor at the 47th floor. Mr. Holt, your son has been at the unit entrance for approximately 20 minutes. He's been knocking. Would you like us to contact him? I read it in the taxi heading back across town. The city moved past the windows in its winter Saturday way, traffic thinner than a weekday. The streets carrying the particular quality of a city that hasn't fully woken up yet, or has already decided the day is not worth the effort. I thought about the first time I'd met Vivienne, a dinner at a restaurant in the West Village that Declan had arranged carefully. I'd noticed at a place expensive enough to signal intention, but not so expensive as to seem like overstatement. She had come in 15 minutes late wearing something that made the lateness forgivable. And when we'd been introduced, she had smiled at me with perfect warmth and said all the right things about how much she'd heard about my work, and I had watched her eyes move just once to the watch on my wrist before they returned to mine. I had tried to tell Declan. Twice. He had not wanted to hear it. I set the phone face down on the seat beside me and looked out at Fifth Avenue as the taxi moved north. Somewhere in the plaza's grand ballroom, 687 people were observing the very public conclusion of an evening that had not gone as planned. Somewhere on the 47th floor of a building on the east side of Midtown, a man in a cashmere coat was standing in front of a door that no longer recognized him. I did not reply to the security supervisor's message. Some doors once closed do not require a response. My house in Brooklyn is not impressive by any standard that Declan and Vivian would recognize. It is a 4-story brownstone on a street in Carroll Gardens that I purchased in 1983, when the neighborhood was still the kind of place where people made things with their hands and did not require a story about the building's history to justify the price. I have not renovated it in the way that the word renovation has come to mean I have repaired it. Maintained it, replaced what stopped working with things that work, and left the rest alone. The shelves in the study hold 40 years of technical manuals and professional references, and a few dozen books that Maggie chose and that I have never moved. The kitchen faces a garden that goes brown in January and green in April, and has never been photographed for anything. I set my keys on the table by the door the way I always do. I sat down in the chair by the window the way I always do. The difference was the phone in my hand and the chain of messages from the building's overnight security supervisor at the Midtown property, which had been accumulating since I'd declined to answer the first one in the taxi. I had not been ignoring them exactly. I had been giving the events they described the time and space that events of a certain kind require before you read about them. I read them now in order from the beginning. 2:14 p.m. Mr. Holt, your son, is at the unit entrance. His key fob and fingerprint are not registering. He has knocked several times. 2:21 p.m. He has found the envelope on the door. He's reading it now. 2:26 p.m. He hasn't moved from the doorway. He's still holding the letter. He hasn't said anything. 2:34 p.m. He asked me if I could let him in. I told him I wasn't authorized to do so per the access revocation order on file with management. He didn't respond. 2:41 p.m. He's still in the hallway. His phone has rung 3 times. He hasn't answered it. 2:49 p.m. He left, took the elevator down. I believe his wife may have been calling. I set the phone on the arm of the chair and looked out at the garden. I had asked Theodore to prepare that letter 3 months ago when I first began to understand that the shape of things was moving in a direction I had hoped it wouldn't. Not the letter's final form that had waited until this morning, when the specific circumstances had been confirmed, but the structure of it, the legal foundation, the clauses that Theodore had spent the better part of an afternoon refining to ensure they would be unambiguous under any reading by any attorney at any tier of the New York court system. The trespassing provision, the trust designation, the phrase effective immediately upon delivery. I had asked him to include the name in full, Maggie Holt Memorial Trust, not a holding company, not a legal entity identifier, the name that she had earned and that I had borrowed to make sure that whatever came next would carry her in it, the way a foundation carries a building invisibly from the ground up, supporting everything above it without requiring acknowledgement. The building supervisor's message at 2:26 stayed with me. He hasn't moved from the doorway. He's still holding the letter. He hasn't said anything. I know Declan's silences, the way I know the silences of mechanisms under stress. There is a difference between a lock that is considering giving way and a lock that has just understood it will not. His silence in the car on US 550 had been the first kind. What the building supervisor described at 2:26 was the second. Whatever Declan had believed about this day, about this week, about the plan he'd constructed with such precision in the months leading up to it, the moment he read that name, he would have understood. Not the full architecture, not all 4 layers of what Theodore had built and I had built and the morning had confirmed, but the essential truth of it, that the thing he had been trying to take had already been given away, and that the person it had been given to was someone who could not be argued with, bargained with, or replaced. A locksmith's principle applied to the matter of legacy. The most secure lock is the one that cannot be picked, because there is nothing on the other side worth taking. The Maggie Holt Memorial Trust would hold everything he had tried to reach, and it would do so forever by design without requiring anyone to stand guard. I heard my neighbor's dog bark twice in the garden next door, a reliable sound, Tuesday through Sunday around the time the afternoon walked into evening. The study light came on by the timer Maggie had set in 2019 and which I had never reprogrammed. I find that I don't mind. The phone began to ring at 7:14. Once I looked at the screen, Declan Holt. I set it face down on the side table. Twice I was already in the kitchen running water for tea. 3 times, 4, 5, 6. The vibration, a dull percussion against the wooden table, crossing the distance between the kitchen and the study, with the particular insistence of someone who has not yet understood that insistence has ceased to be a strategy. I filled the kettle. In my experience, there are 2 types of people who call repeatedly when they know they won't be answered. The first type is hoping against evidence that persistence will change the outcome. The second type is not calling to reach you at all. They are calling because the act of calling is the only thing left that feels like control. By the 8th ring, I had a fairly clear sense of which type Declan had become. The kettle found its temperature. I poured. 2 days after the highway. That was how long it took. The first call came at 6:47. I was in the basement workshop by then, had been for 20 minutes. Ever since the tea had gone cold, and the study had grown too quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when you've been sitting in them too long without anything useful to do. The workshop was different. The workshop had always been different. 50 years of accumulated habit live in that room. The tools hang on the pegboard in the same positions they have occupied since 1987, when I reorganized the wall after a job that had required every pick in my kit, and reminded me that order is not aesthetic preference, it is operational necessity. Pipe vises and follower tools on the left, tension wrenches sorted by thickness on the center panel. The disassembly tray bolted to the bench at the angle that keeps components from rolling. Above the bench, a single fluorescent fixture that I replaced the bulb in last March, and will replace again when it tells me to. The phone vibrated on the bench beside me. I didn't look at it. I was working a mortise lock, an early 20th century piece German manufacture, the kind of hardware that came into the country with immigrant families and outlasted every building it was ever installed in. The mechanism had seized from 50 years of paint accumulation in the keyway, which is the most common and most preventable failure mode for period hardware. And the solution was patience and penetrating oil, and the willingness to let the material tell you when it was ready, rather than forcing a timeline on it. I turned the cylinder by feel a fraction of a degree at a time, listening. 1 call, 2. By the third, I had located the binding pin. I thought about the conversation Declan and I had in his funds office 3 years ago, the one I had initiated, the one I had prepared for. The one that had lasted 11 minutes before he glanced at his phone and told me he had a call with a limited partner. I had been trying to tell him about a pattern I'd noticed in the expense reports. He'd been forwarding a category of disbursements that didn't align with the fund's stated strategy. He had used the words "old school" in a tone that was meant to be gentle and landed as something else entirely. 4, 5, 6. The pin broke free. The cylinder turned a full rotation. I set the lock down and picked up a smaller one, a padlock American manufacture mid-century, the tumbler stack intact, but the springs weakened by oxidation. These are the pieces I work on in the evenings. Not for clients, not for billing. For the same reason that some men work crossword puzzles or play chess, because the hands need something to do when the mind is working on a problem too large for the hands to hold. I thought about Declan at 12 years old standing in this exact workshop, telling me that locks were going to be obsolete in 10 years. Everything would be digital, he'd said. Fingerprints, codes, algorithms. Who needed a physical key? I had told him that physical keys would exist as long as physical things existed that needed protecting, and that algorithms could be defeated by anyone who understood the system well enough to find the gaps. He had not been persuaded. He had also at that time been 12, 7, 8, 9. In the corner against the east wall, the wooden chair that Maggie used to bring a book to when I worked late sat exactly where it had always sat. I have not moved it. I have not made a decision about it. I have simply not moved it, which amounts to the same thing. She would bring whatever she was reading and sit there without expectation of conversation, because she understood that a man at a workbench in the evening is engaged in something that exists alongside speech, rather than requiring it. She had understood that about me in the first year of our marriage, and had never found it a problem. She would not have answered the phone tonight. I was certain of that. She would have poured tea already done, found a book. I reached up to the shelf above the chair, took the first volume my hand found, which happened to be a collected edition of American short stories that she had read at least twice, and that I had read once under her recommendation, and sat down in her chair with the reasonable expectation that the night would resolve itself without her assistance. 14, 15, 16. I read 4 pages of a story about a man in Iowa and a decision he was putting off, which struck me as appropriate. 23, 6:24. The intervals between calls had lengthened. The first hour had been almost constant, 6 minutes, 7 minutes, back to 5. Now the gaps were running 20, 25 minutes. The change in pattern told me something about where Declan was in the process. The first hour was panic, which runs on adrenaline and produces rapid, repetitive behavior. The second hour was something colder, the beginning of calculation, of working out what options remained and what each one cost. By the 47th call at 11:23, I was on the third story in the collection, and the penetrating oil had done its work on the padlock's spring pack. After that silence, I finished the chapter. Set the book on the chair arm with a folded receipt as a bookmark. Turned off the bench light and went upstairs. In the morning, Sunday 7:12, gray winter light through the kitchen window, I checked the phone. 47 missed calls, 23 messages, no emails from legal counsel, which told me Declan had not yet found representation willing to engage on a Saturday night in January. I did not open the messages. I dialed Theodore instead. Set the meeting, I said when he answered. This week, at my workshop. A pause, one of his 2-second calculations. I'll arrange it. I poured coffee and looked out at the garden. The January light was the color of old bone, and the bare branches of the tree against the back fence moved slightly in a wind I couldn't hear through the glass. 47 calls is not a man trying to reach his father. It is a man who has just understood for the first time that everything he thought he had is gone, and that no one is coming to tell him otherwise. Some conversations need to happen in the right room. The footage came through at 8:43 Monday morning. I was already in the workshop, had brought coffee down from the kitchen, and set it on the corner of the bench, while I worked through the last of a set of rim locks that a historical preservation society in Park Slope had sent over for restoration. Straightforward work, the kind that occupies the hands without demanding much from anything else. I had the laptop open on the secondary table the way I keep it when I'm waiting on something. And when the notification came through from the Queen's property server, I set down the tension wrench and moved the chair. The footage was time-stamped, Sunday, November 17th, p.m. I had not been there. I had not needed to be. In 2004, when I secured the house at the Queen's address, a 2-story frame structure that I had purchased 15 years earlier and used primarily for storage of items that required controlled environment and discrete location, I had installed a 12-camera system with motion-activated recording and hourly upload to an off-site server. Standard practice for any property holding assets of significance. The cameras were not visible. The server was not local. Anyone who found the cameras would find at most housings that could be attributed to an older disconnected system. The actual recording nodes were in the structural framing behind finished surfaces, in positions I had chosen because I knew from 50 years of professional work exactly where people look when they are looking for cameras and exactly where they do not. Declan arrived at 11:09 with 2 men I didn't recognize. One carried a hydraulic angle grinder in a hard case. The other had a bolt cutter and a pry bar. Declan had on the same cashmere coat from the highway, and the expression of a man operating past the point where calculation has any use. He knew about the Queen's house. Of course he did. He had been there twice as a child, and once 12 years ago, when I had asked him to retrieve a file box I'd stored in the back room. He had not been curious about it on any of those occasions. He had not asked questions. He had taken the file box and left, and I had thought at the time that his incuriosity was simply the disinterest of a young professional with more pressing concerns. I understood now that he had simply been waiting for a moment when curiosity could be converted into something actionable. The safes were in the basement room. I had installed them over a period of 3 years in the late 1990s, 7 units, ranging from a Gardol floor model with a half-inch steel body to a vintage Mosler combination safe from the 1940s that weighed 400 pounds and had a relocking mechanism that would destroy the boltwork if forced. They were positioned in descending order of apparent value from left to right along the east wall. The Mosler, being the most imposing, occupied the leftmost position. I had chosen them for their appearance specifically. The best security, I had told Ray once, is making them believe they've found what they're looking for. The Mosler took 41 minutes to open with the angle grinder. The man with the tool worked steadily and without apparent emotion, which told me he had done this kind of work before, under circumstances that had not invited questions. Declan stood back, watching his hands in his coat pockets. When the door finally gave, he stepped forward. He looked inside for a long moment. Then he turned to the next safe. That one opened in 18 minutes. It was newer hardware, the steel thinner, the bolt work less robust, also empty. The third, a smaller floor model that I had purchased at an estate sale in New Jersey, yielded in 12. Empty. The fourth, fifth, sixth, the same result. Each one opened and found, wanting the room accumulating the particular quality of a space in which the expected outcome has repeatedly failed to appear. The seventh safe, the smallest unit, a compact security box from the 1970s. The kind of thing that gets passed down through families with old insurance policies and expired passports, and the occasional piece of jewelry that never quite found a permanent home sat on the bottom shelf of the rack at knee height. It was the least impressive object in the room by any visible measure. The angle grinder wasn't necessary. A standard commercial pick would have opened it in under a minute, which anyone with professional knowledge would have understood immediately. Declan cut it open anyway. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded once. He unfolded it. I watched him read it on the camera, his face going very still in the way that faces go still when they have received information that requires the entire rest of the operating system to pause and process. I knew what it said. I had written it myself 3 months ago, when I had finished moving the last of the significant assets out of that room and had decided that an empty vault deserved a response appropriate to its condition. The greatest secret of a locksmith is not what's inside the safe. It's knowing when to move the treasure somewhere else. He stood there for a while. Around him, 7 open safes sat with their doors hanging, the grinder cooling on the floor. The 2 hired men waiting with the particular stillness of people being paid by the hour who have learned not to ask about outcomes. The room held nothing of value by any conventional measure. It held instead the record of a decision made before any of this had started, a decision to put the thing worth protecting somewhere that could not be reached by a man with a hydraulic angle grinder and 40 years of accumulated expectation. The 85 million was in Zurich under the name of the Maggie Holt Foundation in an account structure that Theodore had finalized in November. It had been there since the 1st of December. I closed the laptop. I set my hand on the mortise lock beside the coffee cup and turned it once, the mechanism moving cleanly in the way of things that have been properly maintained. Wednesday, 2 days. There was one conversation left to have, and I already knew which room it needed to happen in. I had the workshop ready by 9:15, not cleaned. The workshop is always clean in the way that working spaces maintained by disciplined people are always clean, which is to say organized rather than spotless. Every tool in its position, every surface cleared of anything that does not serve a current purpose. What I did at 9:15 was set 2 objects on the center of the bench, the antique mortise lock that had belonged to my father, which I had carried in my coat pocket on the highway 5 days ago, and which now sat on the wood surface with the quiet authority of something that has outlasted several generations of the people who used it, and a small white envelope unsealed containing 1 item. Then I pulled up 2 chairs from the storage corner and placed them on the opposite side of the bench from mine. Theodore arrived at 9:45 with his leather portfolio and the expression he reserved for situations that required precision in lieu of warmth. We did not discuss the meeting in advance. We had discussed it sufficiently on Tuesday, and Theodore was not a man who benefited from repetition. At 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I heard Declan's footsteps on the stairs before I saw him. The particular sound of dress shoes on wooden basement steps, a sound that communicates in its hesitation, something about the person descending. He came in first. Vivian followed. I have thought since then about what that room must have looked like to them. The low ceiling and the fluorescent light, and the pegboard wall with its 50 years of accumulated tools, the smell of machine oil and old wood, and the particular dusty warmth of a space that has been used continuously for half a century. The bench with its surface worn smooth in the places where hands have worked it most. 2 chairs on one side, 1 chair on the other with me in it, and Theodore standing to my right with the portfolio open. They had come, I suspected, expecting a room that would make them feel powerful, or at least equal. This room did not do that. Declan looked different from the man in the Range Rover. The coat was the same, the charcoal cashmere still good, still expensive, but the person inside it had compressed somehow, as if the week had removed something structural and the exterior hadn't yet adjusted. He sat down in the left chair without being asked. Vivian took the right and placed her hands in her lap in the careful way of someone who has decided in advance not to react to anything. "Everything is in effect," Theodore said without preamble or softening. "The trust, the account frees the property transfer. The ironclad loan is in default. As of this morning, the fund missed its first payment. That triggers the acceleration clause, which makes the full $8 million immediately due." He set a single document on the bench. "There is nothing in the legal structure that is reversible, contestable, or subject to negotiation." Declan opened his mouth. "I'm not finished," Theodore said. He reached into the portfolio and removed a tablet, placed it on the bench, pressed play. The audio was clear, the recording quality of the Hawk Micro V2 in a sealed vehicle interior is in practical terms excellent. What came through the small speaker was the interior of a Range Rover on a Colorado highway, on a Friday morning in January road, noise heat, fan on low, and 2 voices conducting a conversation they believed was private. Declan's voice measured and precise. "Once he signs, the fund has a bridge to Q2. We restructure by 18 months, and by the time anyone looks closely, the positions will have recovered." Vivian's voice lighter, and if he asks Theodore to review it, Declan, "He won't. I've managed this timeline carefully. He trusts me." A pause. "Then he still thinks this is a family trip." Theodore stopped the recording. The workshop was very quiet. The fluorescent light made its faint, constant sound above us. Outside at street level, a truck moved through the neighborhood with the low percussion of its engine through old brick walls. This recording was made in Mr. Warren Holt's vehicle. Theodore said, in which Mr. Warren Holt was a passenger for the first 6 hours of the journey. He was a party to those conversations. The recording is legally obtained under New York Penal Law Section 250.05. He closed the tablet's cover. "It will not be introduced in criminal proceedings. The portions most relevant to intent were recorded prior to any criminal act, and the prosecutorial threshold would require additional evidence that we are not currently pursuing." He looked at Declan without particular emotion. However, this morning at 8 o'clock, a copy was transmitted to the general partners of Vantage Ridge Capital, the 3 institutional investors, currently in preliminary litigation with your fund, and the New York State Financial Industry Regulatory Contact, who has been monitoring your fund's quarterly filings since September. As a factual disclosure relevant to ongoing civil matters, the transmission is entirely lawful. Vivian looked at her hands. Declan looked at me, For the first time in 5 days, possibly, for the first time in longer than that, he had nothing prepared. No modulated tone, no managed expression, no sentence beginning to form behind his eyes. He simply looked at me the way a mechanism looks when the last tumbler has fallen, and there is nothing left to engage. "So that's it," he said. His voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. "There's nothing left." I reached across the bench and pushed the white envelope toward him. He picked it up, held it, then looked at me again, uncertain before he opened it. The key that fell into his palm was small and plain brass, worn at the bow from decades of handling a simple residential keyway, cut in a profile I had not manufactured since 1978. It was the key to the workshop door at the street level, the one I had cut myself on a Tuesday afternoon in 1975, when I had first rented the space and stood in the empty room and understood that I was going to spend a significant portion of my life there. Declan turned it over in his hand. "What does this open?" he said. I answered his question. "It opens that door," I said. I nodded toward the street-level entrance at the top of the stairs. The door I had first unlocked on a Tuesday morning in March of 1975. With a key, I had cut myself on a machine I had borrowed from my instructor and returned the following week. This workshop, the space I started with. Declan looked at the key in his palm, then at the door, then back at me. I pulled my chair out slightly and sat down in it the way you sit when you have decided to take the time a thing requires. Theodore had packed his portfolio 12 minutes ago and gone upstairs without a word, in the manner of a man who understands after 31 years of professional proximity the difference between a legal matter and a private one. Vivienne was still in the right-hand chair. She had not moved since the recording ended, and she was still looking at her hands, not thinking, I thought, but simply waiting, with the particular quality of waiting that happens when a person no longer has a script. I looked at the workbench between us. "I didn't build $85 million, I said. "I showed up here for 50 years. That's what I built. 50 years of being in this room in the morning, even when the morning didn't offer any particular reason to be here." I set my hand on the mortise lock that sat between us. There were years when the work was good and the money followed it. There were years when neither was true. I showed up anyway, because a man who only works when conditions are favorable hasn't actually learned to work. Declan didn't respond. He was listening. Really listening, not in the strategic way he had listened on the drive through Colorado cataloging information for use, but in the way that people listen when they have run out of alternatives to listening. "Your great-grandfather left me that," I said, indicating the mortise lock. "On the day I opened this place, he stood in this room. It was empty then. Just 4 walls and a concrete floor and a pegboard I'd put up myself the week before. And he handed it to me and said, 'The man who can open any lock is not the man who carries the most keys. It's the man who understands what's worth opening.' I had been 22 years old. I had $200 in my checking account and a set of tools borrowed from the man who had trained me. I had also had Maggie standing outside on the sidewalk in a coat the color of winter wheat because she had decided, apparently, that the doorway of a basement workshop in Brooklyn was not wide enough for 2 people to stand in at the same time, and that the appropriate position from which to witness the beginning of something was to wait outside until it had begun. I had looked out through the door at her and thought, if she believes this is going to work, then I don't have a reasonable argument for why it won't. That had been enough. For 50 years in various forms, it had continued to be enough. "This workshop," I said, "is yours if you want it." The sentence landed in the room the way a key lands on a counter with a small, flat sound that is out of proportion to what it represents. Not the 85 million, not the penthouse, not the fund, not the patents, not the real estate in 3 states. This room. these tools, the client list, which is modest, and the reputation, which is not. I looked at him steadily, the same thing I started with. Not better conditions, not a safety net. The same as what I had, which is to say enough if you're willing to treat it as enough. Declan's hand closed around the key. He didn't say anything. I had not expected him to. There are things that require more than a conversation's worth of time to answer, and this was one of them. A man who has spent 15 years in a world where value is abstracted and leverage is currency, and the actual making of things has been left entirely to other people, does not hear an offer like this one and know immediately what to do with it. He might not know for months. He might never know. That was not my problem to solve. Vivian looked up from her hands. She looked at Declan, then at me, and for a moment, a single moment, her expression held something I hadn't seen in it before. Not the social composure, not the performance of warmth, not the careful neutrality she'd maintained throughout this morning. Something quieter, something that might have been in different circumstances, a beginning of something honest. Then it closed again, and she looked back at her hands. I stood. I put on my coat, the same old security coat that Declan had thrown at me 5 days ago on a Colorado mountain pass, which I had since dried and brushed and returned to its hook, because a coat that has served you well on a difficult day deserves to continue serving. I moved toward the stairs. At the bottom step I stopped. I did not turn around. Maggie always believed you had more in you than this, Declan. My voice came out steady, which was what I had intended. I hope she was right. Then I went up the stairs. Behind me, the workshop held the silence of a space that has just received something too large for immediate measurement, the sound of a key that might open a door, or might spend the rest of its existence in a coat pocket turning over and over in someone's hand while they try to decide whether the door on the other side is one they're willing to walk through. I didn't know which it would be. I am a locksmith. I make keys. What people do with them has always been their own business. April came to Brooklyn the way it always does, without announcement, without ceremony, simply arriving one morning as a quality of light that hadn't been present the day before. I noticed it first in the workshop, through the small window above the secondary bench that faces the street. The light that came through it in January was horizontal and thin, the color of old pewter, arriving at an angle that suggested obligation rather than warmth. The light that came through it on the third Tuesday of April was different. It fell straight and yellow onto the workbench surface and made the grain of the wood look like something worth paying attention to. I had been down here since 6:30, old habit, older than most of the reasons for it. The cherry tree Maggie had planted along the front of the brownstone in 1991 was in full bloom. I could see the edge of it through the window, the lowest branch dropping pale pink against the iron railing. She had chosen it because she said a tree that commits that completely to something for 2 weeks a year and then spends the rest of the year being simply a tree had the right priorities. I had not disagreed. I have not disagreed with her about many things in retrospect. Spring had arrived. The winter in Colorado was 3 months behind me, as distant as a job completed and filed. By February, the fund had been placed in voluntary liquidation. Voluntary in the technical sense, which is to say that the alternative was involuntary, and Declan had chosen the one that preserved what little remained of an orderly process. The institutional investors had settled their preliminary claims against the liquidating assets. The ironclad debt had been absorbed into the proceedings at the accelerated rate, which had not been pleasant for anyone involved and had not been designed to be. By the first week of March, a car service had arrived at the address where Declan and Vivian had been staying, a sublet in Murray Hill, which I knew about because Theodore's office had needed to serve a document and taken possession of a vehicle registered to the fund. They had left New York sometime in mid-March. I didn't know where they'd gone. I hadn't asked. Theodore had called me on the first Monday of April to schedule the final paperwork. We met in his office, not my workshop this time, because this was his territory, the place where documents become permanent, and it seemed correct to honor that. The transfer of the full asset structure into the Maggie Holt Foundation for Children's Education was completed in a single morning session. Theodore's paralegal notarized the final signatures. The Swiss account confirmations came through on the same afternoon. $85 million, accumulated over 50 years by a locksmith from Brooklyn, and a woman who believed that commercial real estate in the 1970s was a reasonable investment for a 26-year-old with more conviction than capital placed permanently and irrevocably into the service of children who needed what Maggie had believed in more than anything else. That education was the only lock worth opening. I had driven back to Brooklyn that afternoon and spent the evening in the workshop not working, just sitting. Ray had called around 8, and we'd talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular. A job he'd bid on in Fort Collins, a documentary he'd watched about the 1977 blackout, the question of whether the diner on 4th Avenue had changed its coffee, or whether we had simply gotten older and less tolerant of mediocre coffee. These are the conversations that constitute a friendship of 33 years. I did not take them for granted. The envelope arrived on a Wednesday in the second week of April. No return address. Brooklyn postmark. Inside a single photograph 4 inches by 6, printed on the kind of photo paper that indicates age, the edges slightly soft from handling. I recognized the picture immediately. Warren Holt, age 22 or 23, sitting at this workbench, this exact workbench. The surface 20 years cleaner, but unmistakably the same grain, with a mortise lock on the disassembly tray, and a small boy standing beside him, one hand resting on the bench edge, the other pointing at something inside the lock mechanism, with the focused curiosity of a child who has just understood that a thing he thought was solid is in fact full of moving parts. Declan, 8 years old, in this room. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in the careful, deliberate printing of a child who has been taught to write clearly and not yet learned to be careless about it, Dad showed me this. That was all. I set the photograph on the bench beside the mortise lock that had come from my father's father, the one that had been in this room since the day I opened it, the one that had ridden in my coat pocket through a Colorado blizzard and come back to its proper place on this bench where it had always belonged. The two objects sat there together, the lock and the photograph, and I looked at them for a while without trying to make them mean more or less than what they were. I didn't know where Declan was. I didn't know whether the key he'd carried out of this workshop in January was in his pocket, or in a drawer, or lost, or fitted into a door somewhere that I would never see. I didn't know whether what had happened between the 3rd Tuesday of April and the 1st Friday of January had changed anything essential in him, or whether it had simply changed the circumstances, which is a different thing entirely. Those were not questions I could answer. They were not mine to answer. What I knew was this: the work was still here. The bench was solid. The tools were in their positions. The pegboard wall held 50 years of ordered equipment, each piece in the place I'd put it, because that was the place where it was most useful, and usefulness had always seemed to me a sufficient standard for where things should go. A knock came from upstairs, the street-level door, 2 measured raps, the sound of someone who had checked the hours before coming and arrived accordingly. I stood. I took the leather apron from its hook and put it on the same way I had put it on every working morning since 1976, when the previous one had finally worn through at the elbow, and I had bought a replacement at a shop on Atlantic Avenue that has since become a wine bar. I looked at the photograph once more, the boy's hand pointing at something inside the lock, the expression on his face that I now recognized as the same expression I had seen on my own face in old photographs, the particular focus of a person who has just discovered that understanding how something works is more interesting than simply using it. Then I went upstairs to open the door. Outside, a woman in her 60s stood on the stoop with a small canvas bag, and inside the bag, visible through the open top, was a padlock with a broken shackle that someone had attempted to force and failed. "I was told you were the best," she said. "I was told that too," I said. "Come in." The April light fell through the open doorway and across the worn wood of the threshold, and for the first time in a long time, longer than the winter, longer than the week in January, longer, perhaps than I had realized until that exact moment I walked through it, carrying nothing I hadn't chosen to carry. My name is Warren Holt. This family story is not one I plan to tell, but it is the one that needed to be told. 50 years of locks and keys taught me one thing above everything else. A man who builds something real is not building money. He is building mornings the habit of showing up when there is no particular reason to, and trusting that the work itself will supply the reason in time. I learned that from a basement in Brooklyn. I should have taught it better than I did. Here is what I would tell anyone listening to grandpa stories like mine: don't wait for the mountain. Don't wait until someone you trusted leaves you standing in a blizzard to understand what you were protecting and why. Ask the hard questions now. Look at the people around you clearly even when clarity is uncomfortable. I didn't, and I paid a price I wouldn't wish on anyone. I'm not a man who speaks about faith easily, but on that highway in the dark, with nothing but an old coat and 50 years of knowing how things work, I felt something I can only describe as grace, the sense that a door I hadn't opened in a long time was finally coming unlocked. I am grateful to God for that moment. It changed how I see everything that came after. Grandpa stories like this one don't always end the way you expect. The best family story rarely does. And this family story, mine, ends not with a verdict, but with a door left open. If something in this stayed with you, leave it in the comments. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more grandpa stories like this, subscribe. There are more keys left to turn. Thank you sincerely for staying until the end. One last thing, the stories ahead contain fictional elements. If that's not the content you're looking for, there's no obligation to stay. But if you're willing to keep the door open a little longer, I'll be here on the other side of it.